Book 6, Part 1 of The Art of War by Niccolò Machiavelli. Translated by Henry Neville. Recording by Clive Catterall. Book 6, Part 1. Zenobi said, "I believe it is well, since the discussion ought to be changed, that Batista take up his office, and I resign mine. And in this case we would come to imitate the good captains, according as I have already learned here from the Lord, who place the best soldiers in the front and in the rear of the army, as it appears necessary to them to have those who bravely enkindle the battle, and those in the rear who bravely sustain it. Cosimo, therefore, begun this discussion prudently, and Batista will prudently finish it. Luigi and I have come in between these, and as each of one of us has taken up his part willingly, so too I believe Batista is about to close it." Batista said, "I have allowed myself to be governed up to now, so too I will allow myself to be governed in the future. Be content, therefore, my lords, to continue your discussions, and if we interrupt you with these questions, you have to excuse us." Fabrizio said, "You do me, as I have already told you, a very great favour, since these interruptions of yours do not take away my imagination, rather they refresh it. But if we want to pursue our subject, I say that it is now time that we quarter this army of ours, since you know that everything desires repose and safety, since to repose oneself and not to repose safely is not complete repose. I am afraid, indeed, that you should not desire that I first quarter them, then had them march, and lastly to fight. And we have done the contrary. Necessity has led us to this, for in wanting to show when marching how an army turns from a marching formation to that of battle, it was necessary first to show how they were organized for battle. But returning to our subject, I say that if you want the encampment to be safe, it must be strong and organized. The industry of the captain makes it organized. Arts or the sight make it strong. The Greeks sought strong locations, and never took positions where there was neither caves or banks of rivers, or a multitude of trees, or other natural cover which should protect them. But the Romans did not encamp safely so much from the location as by arts, nor ever made an encampment in places where they should not have been able to spread out all their forces according to their discipline. From this resulted that the Romans were always able to have one form of encampment, for they wanted the sight to obey them, and not they the sight. The Greeks were not able to observe this, for as they obeyed the sight, and the sights changing the formation, it behooved them that they too should change the mode of encamping and the form of their encampment. The Romans, therefore, where the sight lacked strength, supplied it with their art and industry. And since in this narration of mine I have wanted that the Romans be imitated, I will not depart from their mode of encamping, not, however, observing all their arrangements, but taking only that part which at the present time seems appropriate to me. I have often told you that the Romans had 2 legions of Roman men in their consular armies, which comprised some 11,000 infantry of forces sent by friends or allies to aid them. But they never had more foreign soldiers in their armies than Romans, except for cavalry, which they did not care if they exceeded the number in their legions, and that in every action of theirs they placed the legions in the centre and the auxiliaries on the sides, which method they observed even when they encamped, as you yourselves have been able to read in those who write of their affairs. And therefore I am not about to narrate in detail how they encamped, but will tell you only how I would at present arrange to encamp an army, and then you will know what part of the Roman methods I have treated. You know that at the encounter of 2 Roman legions I have taken 2 battalions of 6,000 infantry and 300 cavalry effective for each battalion, and I have divided them by companies, by arms and names. You know that in organizing the army for marching and fighting I have not made mention of other forces, but have only shown that in doubling the forces nothing else to be done but to double the orders or arrangements. Since at present I want to show you the manner of encamping, it appears proper to me not to stay only with 2 battalions, but to assemble a fair army, and composed, like the Roman, of 2 battalions and as many auxiliary forces. I know that the form of an encampment is more perfect when a complete army is quartered, which matter did not appear necessary to me in the previous demonstration. If I want, therefore, to quarter a fair-sized army of 24,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry effectives, being divided into 4 companies, 2 of your own forces and 2 of foreigners, I would employ this method. When I had found the site where I should want to encamp, I would raise the captain's flag, and around it I would draw a square which would have each face distant from it 50 arm lengths, of which each should look out on to one of the 4 regions of the sky, that is, east, west, south, and north, in which space I would put the quarters of the captain. And as I believe it prudent, and because thus the Romans did in good part, I would divide the armed men from the unarmed, and separate the men who carry burdens from the unburdened ones. I would quarter all or a great part of the armed men on the east side, and the unarmed and burdened ones on the west side, making the east the front and the west the rear of the encampment, and the south and north would be the flanks. And to distinguish the quarters of the armed men I would employ this method. I would run a line from the captain's flag, and would lead it easterly for a distance of 680 arm lengths. I would also run 2 other lines, which I would place in the middle of it, and be of the same length as the former, but distant from each of them by 15 arm lengths, at the extremity of which I would want the east gate to be placed. And the space which exists between the 2 lines I would make a road that would go from the gate to the quarters of the captain, which would be 30 arm lengths in width and 630 long, since the captain's quarters would occupy 50 arm lengths, and call this the captain's way. I would then make another road from the south gate up to the north gate, and cross by the head of the captain's way, and along the east side of the captain's quarters, which would be 1,250 arm lengths long, since it would occupy the entire width of the encampment, and also be 30 arm lengths wide, and be called the crossway. The quarters of the captain, and these 2 roads having been designed, therefore the quarters of the 2 battalions of your own men should begin to be designed. And I would quarter one on the right-hand side of the captain's way, and one on the left. And hence, beyond the space which is occupied by the width of the crossway, I would place 32 quarters on the left side of the captain's way, and 32 on the right, leaving a space of 30 arm lengths between the 16th and 17th quarters, which should serve as a transverse road, which should cross through all of the quarters of the battalions, as will be seen in their partitioning. Of these 2 arrangements of quarters, in the first tents that would be adjacent to the crossway, I would quarter the heads of men-at-arms, and since each company has 150 men-at-arms, there would be assigned 10 men-at-arms to each of the quarters. The area of the quarters of the heads should be 40 arm lengths wide and 10 arm lengths long. And it is to be noted that whenever I say width, I mean from south to north, and when I say length, that from west to east. Those of the men-at-arms should be 15 arm lengths long and 30 wide. In the next 15 quarters, which in all cases are next, which should have their beginning across the transverse road, and which would have the same space as those of the men-at-arms, I would quarter the light cavalry, which, since they are 150, 10 cavalrymen would be assigned to each quarter. And in the 16th, which would be left, I would quarter their head, giving him the same space which is given to the head of men-at-arms. And thus the quarters of the cavalry of the 2 battalions would come to place the captain's way in the centre, and give a rule for the quarters of the infantry, as I will narrate. You have noted that I have quartered 300 cavalry of each battalion, with their heads in 32 quarters situated on the captain's way, and beginning with the crossway, and that from the 16th to the 17th, there is a space of 30 arm lengths to make a transverse road. If I want, therefore, to quarter the 20 companies which constitute the 2 regular battalions, I would place the quarters of every 2 companies behind the quarters of the cavalry, each of which should be 15 arm lengths long and 30 wide, as those of the cavalry, and should be joined on the rear where they touch one another. And in every first quarter of each band that fronts on the crossway, I would quarter the constable of one company, which would come to correspond with the quartering of the head of the men-at-arms, and their quarters alone would have a space 20 arm lengths in width and 10 in length. And in the other 15 quarters in each group, which follow after this up the transverse way, I would quarter a company of infantry on each side, which, as they are 450, 30 would be assigned to each quarter. I would place the other 15 quarters contiguous in each group to those of the cavalry with the same space, in which I would quarter a company of infantry from each group. In the last quarter of each group I would place the constable of the company, who would come to be adjacent to the head of the light cavalry, with a space of 10 arm lengths long and 20 wide. And thus these first 2 rows of quarters would be half of cavalry and half of infantry. And as I want, as I told you in its place, these cavalry to be all effective, and hence without retainers who help taking care of the horses or other necessary things, I would want these infantry quartered behind the cavalry should be obligated to help the owners of the horses in providing and taking care of them, and because of this should be exempt from other activities of the camp, which was the manner observed by the Romans. I would also leave behind these quarters, on all sides, a space of 30 arm lengths to make a road, and I would call one the first road on the right-hand side, and the other the first road on the left, and in each area I would place another row of 32 double quarters, which should face one another on the rear, with the same spaces as those which I have mentioned, and also divided at the 16th in the same manner to create a transverse road, in which I would quarter in each area 4 companies of infantry with the constables on the front at the head and foot of each row. I would also leave on each side another space of 30 arm lengths to create a road which would be called the second road on the right-hand side, and on the other side the second road to the left. I would place another row in each area of 32 double quarters with the same distances and divisions, in which I would quarter on every side 4 companies of infantry with their constables, and thus there would come to be quartered in each 3 rows of quarters per area the cavalry and the companies of infantry of the 2 regular battalions, in the centre of which I would place the captain's way. The 2 battalions of auxiliaries, since I had them composed of the same men, I would quarter on each side of these 2 regular battalions with the same arrangement of double quarters, placing first a row of quarters in which I would quarter half the cavalry and half infantry, distant 30 arm lengths from each other, to create 2 roads which I should call one the third road on the right-hand side, the other the third road on the left-hand. And then I would place on each side 2 other rows of quarters, separate but arranged in the same way as those of the regular battalions, which would create 2 other roads, and all of these would be called by the number and the band where they should be situated, so that all this part of the army would come to be quartered in 12 rows of double quarters, and on 13 roads, counting the captain's way and the crossway. I would want a space of 100 arm lengths all around left between the quarters and the ditch or moat, and if you count all those spaces you will see that from the middle of the quarters of the captain to the east gate there are 700 arm lengths. There remains to us now 2 spaces, of which one is from the quarters of the captain to the south gate, the other from there to the north gate, each of which comes to be, measuring from the centre point, 635 arm lengths. I then subtract from each of these spaces 50 arm lengths, which the quarters of the captain occupies, and 45 arm lengths of plaza, which I want to give to each side, and 30 arm lengths of road, which divides each of the mentioned spaces in the middle, and 100 arm lengths which are left on each side between the quarters and the ditch, and there remains in each area a space left for quarters 400 arm lengths wide and 100 long, measuring the length to include the space occupied by the captain's quarters. Dividing the said length in the middle, therefore, there would be on each side of the captain 40 quarters, 50 arm lengths long and 20 wide, which would total 80 quarters, in which would be quartered the general heads of the battalions, the chamberlains, the masters of the camps, and all those who should have an office in the army, leaving some vacant for some foreigners who might arrive, and for those who should fight through the courtesy of the captain. On the rear side of the captain's quarters I would create a road 30 arm lengths wide from north to south, and call it the front road, which would come to be located along the 80 quarters mentioned, since this road and the crossway would have between them the captain's quarters and the 80 quarters on their flanks. From this front road, and opposite to the captain's quarters, I would create another road which would go from there to the west gate, also 30 arm lengths wide, and corresponding in location and length to the captain's way, and I would call it the way of the plaza. These two roads being located, I would arrange the plaza where the market should be made, which I would place at the head of the way of the plaza, opposite to the captain's quarters, and next to the front road, and would want it to be square, and would allow it 121 arm lengths per side. And from the right hand and left hand side of the said plaza I would make 2 rows of quarters, and each row have 8 double quarters, which would take up 12 arm lengths in length and 30 in width, so that they should be on each side of the plaza, in which there would be 16 quarters, and total 32 altogether, in which I would quarter that cavalry left over from the auxiliary battalions, and if this should not be enough, I would assign them some of the quarters about the captain, and especially those which face the ditch. It remains for us now to quarter the extraordinary pikemen and veleti, which every battalion has, according to our arrangement, in addition to the 10 companies of infantry, 1,000 extraordinary pikemen and 500 veleti, so that the 2 regular battalions have 2,000 extraordinary pikemen and 1,000 extraordinary veleti, and the auxiliaries as many as they, so that one also comes to have to quarter 6,000 infantry, all of whom I would quarter on the west side along the ditches. From the point, therefore, of the front road and northward, leaving the space of 100 arm lengths from those quarters to the ditch, I would place a row of 5 double quarters, which would be 75 arm lengths long and 60 in width, so that with the width divided, each quarters would be allowed 15 arm lengths for length and 30 for width. And as there would be 10 quarters, I would quarter 300 infantry, assigning 30 infantry to each quarters. Leaving then a space of 31 arm lengths, I would place another row of 5 double quarters in a similar manner and with similar spaces, and then another, so that there would be 5 rows of 5 double quarters, which would come to be 50 quarters placed in a straight line on the north side, each distant 100 arm lengths from the ditches, and would quarter 1,500 infantry. Turning then on the left-hand side towards the west gate, I would want in all that tract between them and the said gate 5 other rows of double quarters, in a similar manner and with the same spaces. It is true that from one row to the other there would not be more than 15 arm lengths of space, in which there would also be quartered 1,500 infantry, and thus from the north gate to that of the west, following the ditches, in 100 quarters divided into 10 rows of 5 double quarters per row, the extraordinary pikemen and veleti of the regular battalions would be quartered. And so too from the west gate to that of the south, following the ditches in exactly the same manner, in another 10 rows of 10 quarters per row, the extraordinary pikemen and veleti of the auxiliary battalions would be quartered. Their heads, or rather their constables, could take those quarters on the side towards the ditches, which appeared most convenient for themselves. I would dispose the artillery all along the embankments of the ditches, and in all the other spaces remaining towards the west I would quarter all the unarmed men and all the baggage or impedimenta of the camp. And it has to be understood that this name of impedimenta the ancients intended all those carriages and wagons and all those things which are necessary to an army except the soldiers, as are carpenters, smiths, blacksmiths, shoemakers, engineers, and bombardiers, and others which should be placed among the number of the armed. herdsmen with their herds of castrated sheep and oxen, which are used for feeding the army, and in addition masters of every art or trade, together with public waggons for the public provisions of food and arms. And I would not particularly distinguish their quarters. I would only designate the roads that should not be occupied by them. Then the other spaces remaining between the roads, which would be 4, I would assign in general to all the impedimenta mentioned, that is, 1 to the herdsmen, another to artificers and workmen, another to the public waggons for provisions, and the 4th to the armourers. The roads which I would want left unoccupied would be the way of the plaza, the front road, and in addition a road that should be called the centre road, which should take off at the north and proceed towards the south and pass through the centre of the way of the plaza, which on the west side should have the same effect as the transverse road on the east side. And in addition to this a road that should go around the rear along the quarters of the extraordinary pikemen and veleti, and all these roads should be 30 arm lengths wide, and I would dispose the artillery along the ditches on the rear of the camp. Battista said, "I confess I do not understand, and I also do not believe that to say so makes me ashamed, as this is not my profession. None the less, I like this organization very much. I would want only that you should resolve these doubts for me. The one, why you make the roads and spaces around the quarters so wide. The other, which annoys me more, is this: how are these spaces that you designate for quarters to be used?" Fabrizio said, "You know that I made all the roads 30 arm lengths wide, so that a company of infantry is able to go through them in order or formation, which, if you remember well, I told you that each of these formations were 25 to 30 arm lengths wide. The space between the ditch and the quarters, which is 100 arm lengths wide, is necessary, since the companies and the artillery can be handled there, through which booty is taken, and, when space is needed into which to retire, new ditches and embankments are made. The quarters very distant from the ditches are better, for they are more distant from the fires and other things that might be able to draw the enemy to attack them. As to the second question, my intention is not that every space designated by me is covered by only one pavilion, but is to be used as an all-round convenience for those who are quartered, with several or few tents, so long as they do not go outside its limits. And in designing these quarters, the men must be most experienced and excellent architects, who, as soon as the captain has selected the site, know how to give it form, and divide it, and distinguish the roads, dividing the quarters with cords and hatches in such a practical manner that they might be divided and arranged quickly. And if confusion is not to arise, the camp must always face the same way, so that everyone will know on which road and in which space he has to find his quarters. And this ought to be observed at all times, in every place, and in a manner that it appears to be a movable city, which, wherever it goes, brings with it the same roads, the same houses, and the same appearance, which cannot be observed by those men who, seeking strong locations, have to change the form according to the variations in the sites. But the Romans made the places strong with ditches, ramparts, and embankments, for they placed a space around the camp, and in front of it they dug a ditch, and ordinarily 6 arm lengths wide and 3 deep, which spaces they increased according to the length of time they resided in the one place, and according as they feared the enemy. For myself, I would not at present erect a stockade or rampart, unless I should want to winter in a place. I would, however, dig the ditch and embankment not less than that mentioned, but greater according to the necessity. With respect to the artillery, on every side of the encampment I would have a half-circle ditch, from which the artillery should be able to batter on the flanks whoever should come to attack the moats or ditches. The soldiers ought also to be trained in this practice of knowing how to arrange an encampment, and work with them so that they may aid him in designing it, and the soldiers quick in knowing their places. And none of these is difficult, as will be told in its proper place. For now I want to pass on to the protection of the camp, which, without the distribution or assignment of guards, all the other efforts would be useless. Battista said, "Before you pass on to the guards, I would want you to tell me what methods are employed when others want to place the camp near the enemy, for I do not know whether there is time to be able to organize it without danger." Fabrizio said, "You have to know this, that no captain encamps near the enemy unless he is disposed to come to an engagement whenever the enemy wants. And, if the others are so disposed, there is no danger except the ordinary, since two parts of the army are organized to make an engagement, while the other part makes the encampment. In cases like this, the Romans assigned this method of fortifying the quarters to the triarii, while the principi and the astati remained under arms. They did this because the triarii, being the last to combat, were in time to leave the work if the enemy came, and take up their arms and take their places. If you want to imitate the Romans, you have to assign the making of the encampment to that company which you would want to put in the place of the triarii in the last part of the army. But let us return to the discussion of the guards. I do not seem to find, in connection with the ancients guarding the camp at night, that they had guards outside, distant from the ditches, as is the custom today, which they called the watch. I believe I should do this when I think how the army could be easily deceived, because of the difficulty which exists in checking or reviewing them, for they may be corrupted or attacked by the enemy, so that they judged it dangerous to trust them entirely or in part. And therefore all the power of their protection was within the ditches, which they dug with very great diligence and order, punishing capitally any one who deviated from such an order. How this was arranged by them I will not talk to you further, in order not to tire you, since you are able to see it by yourselves, if you have not seen it up to now. I will say only briefly what would be done by me. I would regularly have a third of the army remain armed every night, and a fourth of them always on foot, who would be distributed throughout the embankments and all the places of the army, with double guards posted at each of its squares, where a part should remain and a part continually go from one side of the encampment to the other. And this arrangement I describe I would also observe by day if I had the enemy near. As to giving it a name, and renewing it every night, and doing the other things that are done in such guarding, since they are things already known, I will not talk further of them. I would only remind you of a most important matter, and by observing it do much good, by not observing it do much evil, which is that great diligence must be used as to who does not lodge within the camp at night, and who arrives there anew. And this is an easy matter to review who is quartered there with those arrangements we have designated, since every quarter having a predetermined number of men, it is an easy thing to see if there are any men missing, or if any are left over, and when they are missing without permission, to punish them as fugitives, and if they are left over, to learn who they are, what they know, and what their conditions. Such diligence results in the enemy not being able to have correspondence with your heads, and not to have co-knowledge of your counsels. If this had not been observed with diligence by the Romans, Claudius Nero could not, when he had Hannibal near to him, have departed from the encampment he had in Lucania, and go and return from the marches, without Hannibal being aware of it. But it is not enough to make these good arrangements, unless they are made to be observed by great security, for there is nothing that wants so much observance as any required in the army. Therefore the laws for their enforcement should be harsh and hard, and the executor very hard. The Romans punished with capital penalty whoever was missing from the guard, whoever abandoned the place given him in combat, whoever brought anything concealed from outside the encampment. If anyone should tell of having performed some great act in battle, and should not have done it, if anyone should have fought except at the command of the captain, if anyone from fear had thrown aside his arms, and if it occurred that an entire cohort or an entire legion had made a similar error, in order that they not all be put to death, they put their names in a purse, and drew the 10th part, and those they put to death. Which penalty was so carried out that if everyone did not hear of it, they at least feared it. And because where there are severe punishments, there also ought to be rewards, so that men should fear and hope at the same time, they proposed rewards for every great deed, such as to him who during the fighting saved the life of one of its citizens, to whoever first climbed the walls of enemy towns, to whoever first entered the encampment of the enemy, to whoever in battle wounded or killed an enemy, to whoever had thrown him from his horse, and thus any act of virtue was recognized and rewarded by the consuls, and publicly praised by everyone. And those who received gifts for any of these things, in addition to the glory and fame they acquired among the soldiers, when they returned to their country, exhibited them with solemn pomp and with great demonstrations among their friends and relatives. It is not to marvel, therefore, if that people acquired so much empire, when they had so great an observance of punishment and reward toward them, which operated either for their good or evil, should merit either praise or censure. It behooves us to observe the greater part of these things. And it does not appear proper for me to be silent on a method of punishment observed by them, which was, that as the miscreant was convicted before the tribune or the consul, he was struck lightly by him with a rod, after which striking of the criminal he was allowed to flee, and all the soldiers allowed to kill him, so that immediately each of them threw stones or darts, or hit him with other arms, of a kind from which he went little alive, and rarely returned to camp. And to such that did return to camp, he was not allowed to return home, except with so much inconvenience and ignominy, that it was much better for him to die. You see this method almost observed by the Swiss, who have the condemned publicly put to death by the other soldiers, which is well considered and done for the best. For if it is desired that one be not a defender of the criminal, the better remedy that is found is to make him the punisher of him the criminal. For in some respects he favours him, while from other desires he longs for his punishment, if he himself is the executioner, than if the execution is carried out by another. If you want, therefore, that one is not to be favoured in his mistakes by a people, a good remedy is to see to it that the public judge him. In support of this, the example of Manlius Capital can be cited, who, when he was accused by the Senate, was defended so much by the public, up to the point where it no longer became the judge, but having become arbiter of his cause, condemned him to death. It is, therefore, a method of punishing this, of doing away with tumults, and of having justice observed. And since, in restraining armed men, the fears of laws and of men is not enough, the ancients added the authority of God, and therefore, with very great ceremony, they made their soldiers swear to observe the military discipline, so that if they did the contrary, they not only had to fear the laws and men, but God. And they used every industry to fill them with religion. End of Book 6, Part 1.